Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the program. I am your host, Chris George Zuger, and you have entered the Den of Lore. Pull up your chair, grab a glass of scotch or whatever you're imbibing tonight, and to the fire, and let's learn some cool shit tonight, courtesy of a good friend and a scholar and author, independent programmer, as well as one of my mentors when it comes to parenthood, good Laird Scranton, as we dissect and investigate the Ganesha, the symbolism behind the great Hindu god, from his work and new book, which is out now. I believe it's available on Amazon and Kindle. Let's see if I can. Let me see if I can switch it over here to the main camera. There we go. Laird, can you know what? I turned the music off. Okay, that's fine. Laird, if you can hold the book up again, that'd be fantastic. Ganesha, the scientific symbolism. So we're going to be talking about that. First, though, I'd love you to be able to join us in on the news segment, which is all about the news. And again, you can add your comment in, or make fun of me for my choices of 3 topics for the morning, or for the evening. So, because now I'm starting to write some jokes. So what is sure to be hyped as the next big thing Apple uses to screw you out of your money for relatively crap products, researchers have developed a graphene device that easily switches from a superconductive material that conducts electricity without losing any energy to an insular that resists the flow of electricity current and back, all with the flip of a switch. This could be a world-changing development for computer engineering, where computers could be designed and built to not have internal resistance, which means they can operate without consuming large amounts of power or generating heat, which currently requires considerable cooling. And as I have in my new rig, a push-pull 280 all-in-one cooler for this massive 9 or 8 core 16-thread processor to keep it a nice toasty, 30 degrees centigrade at all times. It takes a lot of power. So at least in your line of work, Laird, I'm sure that would probably be, very welcome. Now, go ahead. Well, I was going to say, in a blow to wackadoodle anti-vaxxers like Jenna McCartney, and a real and statistically powerful study on autism has confirmed that the disorder is strongly hereditary. The analysis found that over 80% of autism risk is associated with inherited genetic factors. The population-based multinational cohort study included an analytical sample of over 2.7 million individuals, including full birth cohorts of children from Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Israel, and Western Australia, born between January 1st, 1998 and December 31st, 2011, and followed up to age 16. Data was analyzed from September 23, 2016 through February 4th, 2018, and based on population data from 5 countries, the hereditability of ASD was estimated to be approximately 80%, indicating that the variation in ASD occurrence in the population is mostly owing to inherited genetic influences, with no support or contribution from material effects. So that, I think, is quite interesting. And, whether you have thoughts about it one way or another, ladies and gentlemen, numbers, they can lie, but it's very interesting. At least it's something to consider. And finally, confirming what parents worldwide have known for decades. It seems that, much like kids, ghost crabs will always pick fish fingers over vegetables, which is quite surprising. It's true, actually. One of our most common beach crabs eats just like a picky 2-year-old, according to a new research from Edith Crown University. Researchers examined the diet of golden ghost crabs living on sandy beaches in Washington State's Midwest. The ghost crab's diet is mainly made up of algae and other plant materials, but the researchers found that when given the choice in a lab setting, the crabs would opt always to eat for fish. In fact, during the lab tests, the crab consumed 55 times more fish than plant matter and 17 times more fish than snails, their second favorite food source. On average, the crabs consumed fish at an impressive rate of 17.52 milligrams per hour per gram of body weight, which is insane. Now, that is basically the equivalent of 88 kilograms, or an 88 kilogram human eating 1.4 kilograms of fish every hour during the study period. Now, there's no still word on yet as to whether the researchers will conduct a follow-up study on whether the crabs, like 2-year-olds, also annoy the hell out of parents on airplanes. So we are waiting for that next. Yeah, I know that's way up there, but they're supposed to be discontinued now, Laird, as I've been told. Yeah, no, it's gonna come back. So, also, again, I've actually missed this part right here. Now, if you like the show and you'd like to support independent broadcasting, support us at patreon.com/Den of Lore. For as little as $1 a month, you can ensure that this free show stays free of obnoxious ads, besides this one, randomly sprinkled throughout the program, trying to sell you coffee or magic plates or whatever other, hoodoo nonsense that people are trying to get you to buy nowadays on this type of program. So, you can go there, patreon.com/Den of Lore, support the show. You get tons of perks to support, just like a shout out at the top of the program, which I kind of missed, but, the text is small and the monitor is far away. And I forgot to make it larger. So, again, a special shout out to our den mother Ellen, Pat from Brooklyn, Mrs. Fox, and Shafa. So, again, thank you very much for supporting the relaunched Den of Lore. And we're coming up on our fourth year almost, I think. Maybe it's the third year. It's a long time. So, and again, we get to have individuals such as yourself, Laird, back on the show. And I was joking that you're kind of the measuring stick as to whether I can do a good show or not. Because if I can't get a good show out of you, then I need to retire. So, well, I'm assuming that this is a family affair. We don't even really swear on this show anymore, people. So it's okay. But if you would like me to take my shirt off, go to denoflore.com / and donate, and then hit that donate button. And with a large enough of amount, maybe it'll happen. At least not on this one. Well, maybe we'll see. Try it. We'll find out. So, Laird. Oh, it's like a community radio telethons where it's like, we're just going to keep talking until you donate. When you donate, then we'll play a song. It works, and it's raised a lot of money for very good causes. Now, speaking of a good cause, you have been doing a fair amount of work with studying the cosmology of the Dogon, the Dogon, the Maori. Now you have moved on to the connections with Hindu cosmology, and I'm knowing that you would just release this book, I knew that I had to get you on because I know that it's going to be a good show. So, first and foremost, how did you decide to look into the Ganesha mythos and cosmology? What was the link to your past work? Actually, oh, sorry about that, Laird. I think I'm actually having a little bit of an issue on my end with your volume. I'm hearing you, but I'm not. It's not coming through. So give me just 1 second here. This is so, ladies and gentlemen, you are seeing on the fly. Oh, that's why I'll show you audio capture, and we're going to do. Come on, where are you? Skype guest. Skype in one guest. Question guest. Try. Yeah, so I'm trying to get the speakers out. Try Skype 1. Oh, let's try that one. How about now, Laird? Can you?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. Again, we have that sorted out.
Okay. Well, so are we ready to launch here?
We're ready to go.
Okay. Well, I was going to say that during 60 years of research between when the Dogon started being studied and when I began looking into them, not a single researcher, to my knowledge, had any sense of a connection to India from the Dogon. I haven't seen mention of it anywhere. it's not an obvious connection. However, there are hints of it when you look at Dogon language. The Dogon language is unclassifiable technically because they preserve 17 subgroups of languages. They're very careful about keeping the words pure and the meanings pure and so forth. And some of those words are Tamil words, which come out of India. Some of them are arguably Turkish words. Some are ancient Egyptian words. But the Tamil words suggest that there had been some contact in the past with India. But it's not until you get into comparative studies between cultures that you start to see that there are potential connections between the two. It took a while to even sort those out. But I've been wanting to write this book about Ganesha for a long time. This is material that's very close to my heart. Risa and I have always been very fond of Ganesha. Ganesha is one of the most beloved Hindu deities, celebrated by cultures all across India and Asia. Millions and millions of people, in various forms, with a wide variety of different kinds of mythology, wide variance in the names that Ganesha is called, a lot of difference in the way that Ganesha is represented. In one culture, Ganesha is even represented as having a human head, not an elephant's head. In one culture, Ganesha has multiple heads, but there are certain identifying characteristics. Anyway, language really is the first entry point that makes the connection for us. There's a well-known Yale professor by the name of Phyllis Granoff, who wrote a famous article about Ganesha called Ganesha as Metaphor. And she was working from Sanskrit texts that have not been translated, to my knowledge, into English. A text called the Madgala Purana. It's a text that's devoted specifically to Ganesha and Ganesha origins. And she could see, working with this text, that when they were discussing 8 incarnations of Ganesha, she could see that those 8 incarnations were being presented as if they were 8 progressive stages of creation. But she didn't have a context in which to understand what they were talking about. She could see that's what they meant. So she discusses them in her article, and she presents a lot of the evidence as to why this is cosmological information, but she doesn't really have a way of understanding what it is. Part of the problem for scholars in India is that no matter what field of study you approach this material from, whether it's art or whether it's ancient texts, the material only goes back so far. The art, I think, only goes back to around the early centuries AD, and the texts go back as far as the very late centuries BC. And yet, each researcher in his own context, his or her own context, is eventually comments, well, there are reasons why we understand that the material must be much older than that and just didn't survive, because there are indications here that go way, way, way back that Ganesha was celebrated by tribal groups very far back in India's history.
No, I know that the common conception is that she had emerged as a deity in around 200 BC, or 2nd century BC. So if we're talking about a deity that has been worshipped and venerated from ancient times, that seems to your average thinker, average researcher, that it's a little bit of a stretch. Can you speak to that?
Well, the Dogon references are much older. Of course, Ganesha is treated as the first son of Sati or Parvati, and Shiva, who is the male god, but with very many of the same characteristics that Ganesha has. But that material goes back, as we say, to at best a few hundred years BC, and the Dogon material picks up at around 3000 BC. So we have 3,000 year gap there in information, but framed in relation to many of the same phonetics and many of the same words, but 3,000 years worth of time for the meanings of the words to have evolved, and 3,000 years for the impression of the concepts to have changed. At 3000 BC, you have what looks like scientific descriptions. You don't have anthropomorphized deities, particularly. As a matter of fact, with the Dogon, we catch them in the very act of anthropomorphizing a cosmological concept with one of their diagrams that directly relates to Ganesha.
Okay, would you be able to explain this a little in depth in terms of how they were able to do that?
Okay, the Dogon, they discuss concepts of creation and they associate them with drawings that are used to illustrate them. And so one of the keys, they're talking about how particles of matter form from waves. And they understand that matter begins as waves, and they understand that it ends up like an atom. And in between, there are some significant stages and structures that they define. And the first coherent structure is called the Po Pilu. It represents a spiral of matter that supposedly exists at every point in space and time. Now, that spiral of matter can be looked at a couple of different ways, and these are really they're indications that these are dimensional views from some points. They are geometric views from one point of view. So the structure has 8 stages to it, 7 physical stages and 1 conceptual one. And one way the Dogon represented is as 7 rays of a star that are emitted from a single point. These are rays of increasing length, and so you end up with what look like little lines of rays of light coming out of a central point that, because they get longer as they emerge, you can describe a spiral around them, a Fibonacci spiral around them. Okay, they refer to the structure as the Po Pilu, which also means the egg of the world, or you can think of it as the spiral of the world. Now, those rays, those 7 rays, there's another little game they like to play with those 7 rays. They like to make a little stick figure out of it. They take the top 2 rays and make them into a head, and then depending on one of 2 views, they either then make the next 2 rays into arms, the next 2 rays into legs, and the last ray into a single tusk, or it can be referred to as the sex of the Po Pilu, but the word for sex also can mean tusk. The second way they anthropomorphize it is with 2 rays as a head, the next 4 rays as arms, and the last ray a leg that the figure is dancing on. Now, these are the 2 quintessential representations of Ganesha in India in art. He's represented primarily in 2 ways. One is as 2-armed with a single tusk, and the other one is as 2-armed with a single tusk, and the other one is as 4-armed dancing on 1 leg. Now, so that's very suggestive from the outset. Just realizing that they've somehow coincidentally matched these 2 poses is very suggestive. Turns out the word Pilu has significance in various ancient languages. It's in Turkish and in the Tamil language, in other languages, pil can refer to the concept of an elephant, the concept of a tusk. It can refer to the color white. It can refer to the concept of a sun. These are all iconic attributes of Ganesha. So now we have the 2 poses corresponding to a name, Po Pilu, that links to all of these attributes of Ganesha. It's more than coincidental. I was taught by my science teachers that when you bump up against the first coincidence, it's time to start considering whether there's something going on besides coincidence. That a coincidence is supposed to be taken as a thing, 1 in 1,000 chance that 2 things could align with each other. When you start getting into 2 and 3 coincidences, you've pushed it beyond the point where a reasonable person should believe that it's coincidence anymore. If you have that much tolerance for coincidence, you don't have a scientific mindset.
Now, Ganesha has close to 32 forms, or actually 32 forms. So if we're only talking about one particular form, that could be seen as a little bit of a coincidence. But how does it match up against 32?
Well, over 3,000 years, and seeing how India's culture loved to play with the representation of things. It's the audience for cosmology in India wasn't satisfied with just a description of something. If there was any nuance to that description at all, they'd want to know why. How come? How come Ganesha has an elephant's head? How did that happen? How come Shiva is said to have beheaded him? How come Shiva wasn't there when he was born? How could Shiva not know Ganesha was the son of Sati or Parvati? So every time the audience would ask one of those questions, you'd see another mythical, a storyline of a myth pop up, whose purpose seemed to be to explain that next question. And so it's easy to imagine over time how what began as 2 descriptive poses ended up as 30 or more descriptive poses. And even more if you consider what artists will tend to do with a figure, even in terms of in modern art. If you look at any popular figure in modern art that's been around for 2,000 years, you see how many different presentations there are of the same thing that have evolved over time. You can't imagine that all of those were original. So part of what we're trying to do is arrive at original forms, and the Dogon are an excellent place to do that, because the Dogon as a culture prioritize the preservation of original forms with everything, with language, with word meanings, with myth storylines of myths, with diagrams that go along with their cosmology, even with their civic practices. You can predict what ancient Egyptians were doing at 3000 BC if you know what the Dogon are doing now. There's a predictive element there. I have a high degree of confidence that anything the Dogon are doing today will be able to produce evidence that the ancient Egyptians did it at 3000 BC.
Okay, and if we're talking about comparative cosmology, and if you had mentioned that there were multiple crosses or references that could be attributed back from the iconography of Ganesha to the Dogon, what are some of the other ones that you found within your studies?
Many of the Dogon words. Let's back this up a little bit.
Okay.
We see in Hinduism, deities presented in relation to dual phonetics. Ganesha's mother's name is Sati. These are, in English, 2-letter syllables that are combined together. And the Dogon language preserves those original syllables and provides us with clear definitions of what each of those syllables means. It's also true that many of the ancient Egyptian words are built on the same phonetics. Many of the Dogon words, also predictably, many of the Dogon cosmological words, you can go to an Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary and find the same cluster of meanings that go with the Dogon word in the Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary under the same phonetics. The particular form the Dogon phonetics are in happen to be sort of root building blocks. In Maori language in New Zealand, looking at a Maori dictionary, I can predict what a Maori word is going to represent based on its phonetics, because it's constructed from these same building blocks. I know that the phonetic sa refers to knowledge. And there are multiple meanings that can go with these phonetics. They also have clusters of meanings. But the phonetics define root concepts. And so when you put the phonetics together, you can use them as building blocks to construct the meaning of a more complicated word.
Now, if these words had been originated within 3000 BC, obviously human migration can be done fairly quickly. I think I once calculated you could walk from Cairo, I forget if it was Cairo to, was it like Cairo to Spain, and it would take you like something stupid like 25 hours. Maybe it was Cairo to Jerusalem, and it was like a 25-hour walk, or like not a 25-hour walk, but it would take you about like 25 days instead of like going around in circles for 40 years. It's a very,
Right.
very short distance.
Right.
So how did these Dogon terms, like, what is the progression from the middle of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, to the subcontinent? It seems that there may have been ample opportunity for exchange of ideas, especially with the Indus Valley having a tremendous amount of influence with trade in Mesopotamia during 6000 BC and up until its disappearance. How were these concepts gradual over time, or did they appear originally within the subcontinent at about the same time as with the Dogon?
From my point of view, I'm tracking the cosmological tradition, which is a symbolic tradition, but
Okay.
it's associated with civilizing skills. It's associated with agriculture, with stonemasonry, metallurgy, animal husbandry, pottery. There are a whole cluster of skills that make their first appearance in the region of Göbekli Tepe and in the Fertile Crescent at around 9000 BC. And they migrate outward from there sort of radially. You can track, researchers have tracked them following DNA, following language, following the civilizing skills. They can demonstrate what directions they moved in and how quickly they arrived at certain places. They move by one path of transmission. They move south and eastward down through what became India, as far south and east as Australia, actually. That's one path of transmission. Another path of transmission flows down from Turkey into the region of Palestine, and then seems to make a jump by sea from Palestine to the tip of northern Africa and on to northern Scotland. There are other stops in between. Actually, this will be the subject matter of a book I'm presently working on, is tracking precisely how it got from the Fertile Crescent region to Orkney and with what stops in between.
And in our past interviews, and you can go check those out on our YouTube channel, I'm fairly certain I still have them up. We had discussed a considerable amount of the teaching methods, or at least the theorized teaching methods that were used within certain cultures or certain groups that were brought to a certain location and then basically taught,
all those things I talked about, right?
Exactly, all those things you talked about. So
it's primarily agriculture and symbolic cosmology.
So is there something very similar that was present within the subcontinent?
Yes, it's an extension of the tradition that began at Göbekli Tepe.
Okay.
It was carried into India by way of a group called the Shakti cult, which is a matriarchal cult, an archaic cult that still exists. Actually, they have a center of worship on the sort of the east flank of the peninsula of India in a region called Orissa.
Oh.
Now they also celebrate Ganesha, but from their perspective, Ganesha was the son of two mothers. There are two mother goddesses who are explicitly claimed to have been the two mothers of Ganesha. In Dogon tradition, the Dogons say that if it were possible to take the DNA from two women and combine it, you would create the perfect being. That, to their mode of thinking, the perfect transmission of DNA would be from two mothers, not from a mother and a father.
And how were they? Well, is there a certain basis that they ascribe to this? Is there certain traits that they believe would lead to this?
They don't really explain the details of that. They just make the statement that the observation that, by the way, if you could do that, you'd produce the perfect being. Well, we might see that as a carryover of the tradition from the Shakti cult, where Ganesha is pretty much treated as the perfect being, and he is, in their estimation, the son of two mothers. In the Shakti cult, the two goddesses are invariably pictured in the company of Ganesha. Now, the names of the Hindu deities are formed, to go back to language, are formed from the building blocks I was talking about, the phonetic building blocks that the Dogon preserve. And from my perspective, the Dogon preserve original meanings for those phonetics. So when we start looking at attributes of Ganesha or attributes of Ganesha's origin story that relate to those kinds of phonetics, India has its take on what the word means, but the word can also be examined in terms of what the phonetic roots, the Dogon phonetic roots, represented to mean. So it's interesting that in India, one of the names for Ganesha is Ganapati. That's actually his alternate name in India. He's known as often by Ganapati as by Ganesha. Ganapati in Sanskrit refers to the concept of the Lord of the Ganas. That's the way it's interpreted. With the Ganas being an obscure concept that it has its own detailed explanations. For the Dogon, if we trace back to this figure, the Popilu that I'm talking about, which is the spiral of the world or the egg of the world, the word Gana means world, and the phonetic value Pa refers to the concept of rotating and extending, which is the definition of a spiral. So Ganapati, in terms of Dogon phonetics, refers to the one of the world spiral. In other words, if we examine the Indian word in terms of the Dogon roots, we hit precisely the Dogon definition of what the thing represents.
Which is kind of mind-blowing if you think about it. And that goes to the concept of, well, if you run into more than one coincidence, then you have to start thinking about what that actually means.
Right. At some point in the process, you have to sincerely consider, is there linkage here? And then start to pursue it and test it and see what are the boundaries of those of the correspondence between the two. What I've discovered is there's pretty much complete correspondence here, that the symbolism that survives in India for Ganesha goes quite well hand in hand with the scientifically based symbolism that the Dogon represent. That there are root concepts of energy that pertain to Ganesha. And part of the process of sorting that out is understanding how this well, it's complicated to explain, but in the end it's a very simple set of dynamics of how energy moves from the domain of wave-like existence to the domain of particle-like existence. That was the subject of my book, Seeking the Primordial, which was the previous self-published book. Trying to get down to the roots of what that energy was. Well, the Dogon say with their diagrams, their process begins. One of the first major forms is a circle with the dot in the middle of it. Sort of that's the equivalent of the Egyptian sun glyph. The Dogon refer to it as the egg in a ball. The dot is the egg, and the circle around it is the ball. But what it actually represents, when you get into the detailed descriptions that the Dogon give, and when they're talking about how energy works, you realize what it represents is the concept of angular momentum, which is a concept of physics that pertains to spinning energy. Spinning is something that Ganesha does. The way an astrophysicist diagrams angular momentum is as a circle with a center, a circle with a dot in the middle of it. So energetically, starting at that point, we then try to connect the dots to the next Dogon figure. The next conceptual figure for the Dogon is the spiral I was talking about, which has the 7 rays that can be conceptualized either as a spiral or as 7 rays of a star. There's an 8th conceptual stage where the longest ray of the star pierces an egg, the shell of an egg that surrounds that spiral, or those rays. And when it pierces it, that's the conceptual end of the first egg. and it's the initiating point of the next egg. And these eggs supposedly exist at every point in space and time. This is how what matter is based on. Well, when we look into the concept of angular momentum from the standpoint of science, the spinning energy, we discover that spinning energy evokes a series of 7 vectors in a plane that sits perpendicular to the spinning energy. So if you imagine a circle with a dot in the middle of it, and the circle is the energy spinning around like a top, suddenly that evokes what in fact are rays of light or rays of energy that are in a plane that sits perpendicular to that spinning energy, 7 rays that increase in length as time goes on. The reason they increase is because as the energy is spinning, it attains mass. Einstein says that if you accelerate energy, it becomes more massive. As it becomes more massive, you slow down its time frame. Einstein says that, the example Einstein gives is if you had a team of astronauts who were traveling in a spaceship at very close to the speed of light, traveling away from the Earth, and then they return back, they would discover when they got here that all of their friends had aged much more than they had. Their friends might be old men and women now, whereas for them only a few years had passed. Many years would have passed for the people on Earth. It's because when you accelerate a body, it's the same thing as making it more massive, and both things will cause its time frame to slow down, a relative time frame to slow down. Time basically runs slower for a thing that's more massive.
So why would the Dogon and the Shaktian, for that matter, why would this information be encoded in allegory in deic? Trying to find the proper term in the symbolism and iconography of a deity, and therefore, if what you're saying is true, then it's linked back to what the Dogon have said. I know that we've again talked at length on what the potential for a material versus an immaterial world, based on their teaching and their cosmology. But this seems to go into trying to be able to teach the fundamentals of the universe, which we're starting to learn and have been, researching for the last 100 or so years, and trying to be able to, produce spaceships with it, or, use it to peer across the galaxy at stars that are billions of light years away. What would a relatively, nomadic people in the middle of Africa, or, people in the middle of the subcontinent need with, which is essentially, Einstein's general relativity theorem.
Right. Well, I'll explain that. There is a sensible rationale, a sensible motive for why that was done. You sort of have to break it down into pieces. To give you the whole rationale right now, I would be speaking out an entire book. But let's start with the rationale of the people who are teaching this. What they're teaching, along with they had 2 goals from what the comparative view tells us. The first goal was to move humanity from a status of hunting and gathering to a status of farming. Pretty doable goal. So they were teaching skills of agriculture and skills of community, how to organize a community, how to live among other people.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now that instruction was tagged to a bunch of scientific concepts. From the perspective of the teachers, that science was not given as theory, it was given as fact. This is factual information about how material creation happens. And ultimately it was aimed at a future audience that was scientifically enough minded to recognize what it was. There is no point in having a hunter-gatherer know about the root dynamics of energy. The target audience was essentially us, or a culture like us, one that had a sense of science enough to be able to recognize, hey, that looks like an atom. Hey, that looks like an electron orbital. Hey, that looks like a whatever. The most essential of the Buddhist symbols, called adequate symbols, are precisely that. And they're admittedly that. They are images of things in nature that cannot lose their meaning because the meaning inheres in what they're picturing. If you're picturing the image of an electron orbit, those take specific shapes. Anybody who's scientifically minded is going to recognize that shape and say, wow, there's an electron orbit, and they go do some research and discovered the Buddhists describe it just like an electron orbit. This is science. Now, so the motivation was to try to put this highly technical scientific information into a form that was so mnemonic, so intuitive, that all of the intervening generations between when it was taught and the generation that was the target audience would be able to keep it straight. In other words, someone was aiming this stuff with the hope that someone like me would see it, recognize it, and sort of deconstruct it and realize, here's what we're talking about. And we're not just talking about it in an incidental way. It's point after point after point after point. Not only that, it tells us things in a way that is much more intuitively understandable than the way science teaches it. And so Stephen Hawking doesn't even attempt to explain how a wave turns into a particle. The Dogen explain it fairly easily. Once you understand what the root dynamics are, it's completely understandable to me how a wave turns into a particle. But to get it, you have to look at it the way the Dogen look at it. So from the perspective of the teachers, the motive wasn't to have the intervening generations understand it. The motive was to have somebody like us understand it. As a matter of fact, Thomas Young, the British polymath who tried to decipher the Egyptian hieroglyphs first, was so convinced that there was more to the Egyptian hieroglyphs than just phonetics that he struggled with it for months and months and months, and just didn't have enough of a perspective on the science to be able to sort out what they were talking about. Champollion, who took up the task after Thomas did, delayed publishing his findings. He had comparative text, and he was able to do a word-for-word translation and knew he had the word-for-word translation right, but he still held up publishing for a number of months because he had an abiding sense that there was more to this stuff than just those word translations. He was right. He was just a century too soon to be able to have a clue about what it was.
And as you know, we've discussed on this show and on many other shows, at least when talking with the Magical Egypt film team, which I know that you're a part of that project as well, and Magical Egypt 2,
right,
which is available. You can stream that right now on online as well. You can see
I'll tell you a quick story about my involvement with Magical Egypt. I had self-published my first book and sent out targeted emails to people I thought might have an interest in the book. It was called Hidden Meanings. It became The Science of the Dogen. So one of those emails happened to find John Anthony West in Egypt as he was conducting a tour. And he wanted to read the book, but I had only told him where he could buy the book. He was the sort of guy who had authors lined up, down the block and around the corner waiting to hand him books. So he got back to the United States, realized that he lived 45 minutes south of me, and he ended up calling me one night on the phone and kept me on the phone long enough till I finally offered to send him a book. Well, so then he invited me down to his house to meet him, but didn't tell me that he was going to film the entire meeting. And that episode, the filming of that entire meeting, became episode 8 of the first Magical Egypt series. And that's how I became connected to that. I had no clue I was walking into a filmed interview.
Yeah, I've heard stories of John Anthony West having, well, that kind of attitude. It's like, oh, we're just going to spring this on and see what happens, And I know that from watching episode 8, which again you can find that pretty well anywhere, but you can also purchase the new remastered HD version. No, they do not sponsor the show, but I love Chance and Venice. You can go check it out because it looks fantastic, and I know from that interview it kind of set me on the path to getting to know your work, and the similarities seem to be kind of mind-boggling, because it's a matter of like fundamentally trying to understand the nature of the world around us. It's one thing to know the path; it's another thing to walk the path. I know that's kind of a bad analogy in this case, but like I've studied as a layperson astrophysics, physics, chemistry, astronomy, and yes, like string theory and quantum, quantum mechanics is something that's very, very interesting to me. And there seems to be in the scientific community, which I do greatly respect, that there are two modes of teaching, which is the long drawn out, well, you need to be able to understand the fundamentals, and there's a very, very complicated process. There's no attempt to try and necessarily talk to people like you and me who can get it, as it were, with just a little bit of nudging and kind of I should say a difference in explaining the situation, and then there's that method of
being able to shortcut it.
Like, well, shortcut it. Like, take out the fluff and just like, give me the understand. Like, give me the meat and potatoes so I can figure it out. Or the plain and simple, I'm trying to not be demeaning here, but very flashy pictures on TV to basically try and explain a very complicated subject, but it's like they're talking to 5-year-olds. It feels kind of demeaning. And it's like, no, I can sit back and, let's say, listen to a, Leonard Susskind lecture, that he gives to university students. And I'll understand about 99% of everything that he says, because, you're basically learning like you weren't in school, but you have to consume 1.5 to 3 hours times like 100 classes to be able to get a deeper understanding. Where it's like, okay, well, how does a wave turn into a particle? Well, okay, what can you explain that process? And nobody is really doing that. It frustrates me.
Right. I mean, you can say to somebody, if you know what their frame of reference is, you can say to somebody that angular momentum is the dynamic of a spinning top. Now, if they have that frame of reference, now they have the entire concept in one statement, because they know what a spinning top is. If you say to them, these two processes are parallel, then they may not know the nuances of difference, but they have their arms around the concept with that one image. Well, one of the goals of the ancient tradition was they were aiming this information at an audience that they didn't know what their frame of reference was going to be. And so how do you come up with that intuitive reference for somebody who you don't know what their reference is? And so what the symbolic system does is it frames the same idea in multiple metaphors out of the hope, at least from what I can see, it looks like it was the hope, that one of those multiple metaphors was going to resonate with the audience that it was aimed at. If they don't get that this relates to how a plant grows, maybe they'll get that it relates to how the animal kingdom works. Or maybe they'll get that it relates to the process in which you construct a structure. So they pick these multiple metaphors and say, look, these metaphors are parallel to each other. They're parallel to a process I want you to understand. If you understand any one of these things, you understand the process I'm trying to tell you. And that orients you, and now you're in a position to evaluate the thing they're telling you.
And, that goes to the one of my favorite metaphors, herding cats. Where it's, you're trying to be able to corral a very large force in a certain direction, and if anybody knows, trying to be able to get your cat to do anything, they're either just going to look at you funny and just go like meow, or ask for treats, right, or they're going to run away, or they're going to go in the exact opposite direction. So that type of concept is not foreign. You're taking terms and putting it into, as you said, things that people can understand or relate to. And
right, because if you had to describe that kind of chaos in words, you could go on pages and pages, and the person might not be getting what you're really talking about,
or they might fall asleep.
Right.
It's certain. I'm going to say, like, I will listen to podcasts on astrophysics or astronomy or futurism, and it's just like the nice deep voice and just calm demeanor just kind of lulls me to sleep. And I try and learn while I'm sleeping, but I get about 5 minutes in and I'm out. Whereas this type of exchange, it's very similar to the way that the information was transmitted back then, where it was person to person and saying, well, hey, this is what I'm trying to teach you, but this is this is how you can relate to it based on your frame of reference. And if we're talking thousands of years of transmission, and you had mentioned the Shakti cults in it was on the East Coast or the West Coast.
They're on the east coast of India.
Okay, so if these cults had brought this information forward, do you go into any length about how the information was transferred, how it was brought along from Göbekli Tepe, from...
I do to a certain extent in the book Point of Origin. I talk about the Shakti cult and in what forms they brought it forward and how we can tell it was brought forward. Things get tricky before 3000 BC because you don't have written texts to rely on. But you do have some dynamics of language that are really helpful. One is that the further back in time you go from there, the more common the words are. So the other effect of language is that significant words tend to stay within a language for very, very long periods of time. So what that means is that ancient Turkish words were pronounced and had pretty much the same meanings as ancient Egyptian words do. And many of those words are still in the Turkish language. So if I want to understand a concept from ancient Turkey, I can use a modern Turkish dictionary and compare it to an ancient Egyptian dictionary. And where I find points of overlap, I've likely triangulated on what the ancient concept was, even though I don't have an ancient Turkish dictionary from 9000 BC. So it's techniques like that, being able to infer things, find ways of inferring things that we don't have an explicit reference for, but we can triangulate on in a way that is absolute enough to go with.
Now, there are other individuals, and I know there will be doubters, there's always pushback, and I'm not trying to get negative, but again, I do have to do my due diligence and
sure.
being what's the term?
Skeptical.
No, not skeptical. Like, I have to be fair. I have to be fair. So right. There will be people who say, well, oh, it's just a coincidence. And I know that you had said that there are multiple coincidences. What has been, are there any sources, at least that somebody from the mainstream academic community would be able to say, okay, well, what credible evidence do you have that this is, that there is a link? What, is there a linguistic map or evolution that you can point to or that you can lay out to somebody who has this type of pushback and say, well, no, here's a link from, let's say, like ancient, Dogon to ancient Egyptian to ancient Turkish to, to Sanskrit?
Yes and no. Okay, if I'm a linguist, most linguists only allow a relationship between words, a claim of a relationship between words, if you can trace a clear etymology between the two words in the two languages. It started here, it ended up there, passed through these modifications, here's how this word became that word, they're related, now I accept that they're related words. Dealing with comparative cosmology, it's a different ballgame. In these ancient words don't carry a single meaning, they carry a cluster of meanings, and those meanings are logically disconnected from each other in such a way that I can't reasonably guess the secondary meanings by knowing the first meaning. But the clusters hold true from culture to culture, from language to language, and the clusters flow with the concepts, not with the phonetics. And so when I take two very different languages, like the Egyptian hieroglyphic language or the Dogon language, and compare that to Sanskrit, which outwardly is very different, there aren't obvious points of overlap between those two languages. I can point to a concept that is one of these clustered concepts and demonstrate that it's the same. The same cluster exists in Sanskrit that exists in the Dogon language. That can't happen randomly. When you have half a dozen logically disconnected elements associated with each other, you've got a match. A linguist wouldn't agree that it was a match, but any reasonable thinking person would. I'll give you an example. In Dogon culture, you have a creator god named Amma. Actually, originally With symbolic reversals, the signs are it was a goddess. Amma is the affectionate name that Ganesha used to call his mother. Amma is the Dogon hidden god or goddess. The word also means to grasp or to hold firm or to establish. You go to ancient Egypt, you have Amen, who has many of the same icons as Amma, holds the same relationship in the overall cosmology to the other deities that Amma has to characters in Dogon mythology, is attributed with similar actions as Amma in Dogon mythology, and the name also means to be hidden, it means to grasp, it means to hold firm, it means to establish. Now, from my standpoint as a comparative researcher, I have an ample cluster of elements there to insist that those two things are related. A linguist would say they're not. But I say, you're really going to tell me that I can positively identify that these two gods hold the same role in parallel cosmologies, doing the same thing in relation to the same phonetics. All of the icons match, all of their actions match, but you're going to insist that the names aren't related? And I say, bullshit. No reasonable person will accept that. The same cluster that allows me to correlate the deities allows me to correlate the words. And a linguist won't like that because it's not according to their rules.
No, and I can understand that. Coming from a linguistic family and being in a linguistic profession, I can understand that perspective. And I have a question actually from Lee, which may be touching a little bit far outside of what we the subject matter here, but hey, this is what we do here on the show, so why not? He's asking if there are any similarities with the Inca or Aztec mythologies. I'm not sure if he means, obviously between Inca and Aztec there are similarities, but are there any to the subject that we're talking to tonight?
Okay, I haven't studied Inca and Aztec symbolism to the depth that I've studied some other cultures, but I have seen enough to understand that they're related. And the way I can make that kind of a positive statement is with any culture, okay, the cosmology rests on certain signature elements. I can give you examples of that. Circumcision is one of the signatures of the tradition I'm pursuing. Any culture that's circumcised, I know immediately was probably influenced by the system I'm talking about. Any culture that measured with cubits is likely to be connected to the same system. Any culture that imagines that there's a wheel or a chariot associated with the constellation of Orion is likely to be associated with the same tradition. These are signatures. Any culture where their deities flipped from goddesses to gods sometime after 3000 BC is likely related to the same tradition. That's a function of the tradition I'm talking about. There are symbolic reversals midway through the tradition that occur for a reason. We have some people argue that pyramids represent parallel development, that any culture that builds out of stone is eventually going to figure out to stack them up into a pyramid. There are only so many things you can do with stone. My answer to that is, yes, the structures could be an example of parallel development, but there is very complicated symbolism that goes along with the structures that doesn't automatically accrue from the choice to stack up the stones. And that symbolism is the kind of linkage that argues there's got to be a connection back to the same source. So I know from Aztec and Incas, I know enough about them to be able to say with confidence that they were absolutely influenced by the same tradition. I just haven't explored it far enough to be able to give you chapter and verse as to why that has to be.
And obviously for that, there may be a book upcoming at some point in the future about that, and I'm sure that if and when that comes, you'll hear about it here. And Laird, it's the top of the hour, and I know that with the new show format, and being a busy parent myself with tons of responsibilities, like laundry and cleaning up diapers, We don't do the 3.5-hour shows like we used to way back in the day. So I'd like to at least close out with allowing you the opportunity to be able to tell the people at home or on whatever spaceship, or if you're listening in the car, keep your eye on the road. Keep your eye on the road, not on the phone. You're on the road. Where can they get the book? How much is it in American rubles, and is it available in hardcover, digital copy? What's the deal?
Well, this book is self-published. What I've been doing the past couple of years is because the lead time is so long for the traditionally published books, and I have so much material that I'm working with, that I can finish writing a second book and self-publish it 6 months or more before the traditionally published book comes out. And so that's what I've been doing, is I've been traditionally publishing one and then self-publishing a second one the same year. So this is self-published. It's available through any of the Amazon sites worldwide right now. It can be ordered through any bookstore. It's available to any of the retail outlets. If they wanted to stock it, they could. Question is whether they have enough awareness that the book's out to do that. But you could walk into a Barnes & Noble and order it, and they could get it for you.
That's fantastic. The age we live in.
It's $15.95 on Amazon. I'm not sure what that translates to in euros, but
euros probably around like 12 euros in Canadian dollars. Your firstborn and immortal soul, because the exchange rate sucks still. So Canadian.
I have no idea what it is in centigrade.
Well, yeah, it's hot, Laird. It's hot up here. 40. What is it? Like 40 degrees. It's like 120, 125 with humidity.
Man.
Oh man.
Yes. Well, we're gonna go to 106 degree heat index down here tomorrow.
Oh, good luck with that. Keep jump. Get your pool out. Get the beer with a little kiddie pool, and put your feet in there, and just wave to the people as they drive by.
Yeah.
All right, so this is the end of the show. Go check out the Patreon page. It is up. We're still working on. If you've been following the lunch hangouts, there's going to be a series of them. And if you like to go to sleep during lunchtime, come watch me build a website. I can guarantee you I am considerably less entertaining on those hangouts, but you learn a lot, especially about WordPress and CSS programming. It's good times, people. So you get in on those. So yes, I'm going to play the outro music. Let's see if the actual outro music plays. How about that? That's a good. Does the outro music?
Suspense.
And our my friend Abe Van Dam, who wrote or the remix for our outro music. There we go. He has a new EP coming out soon. Whenever that drops, I'll let you guys know about it, because support your local artists. And go to the show. Don't ask for guest list. Pay the cover charge, because chances are the beer tickets are coming out of his pay. So just do your thing, people. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I am the host of Den of Lore. We are back yet again, and hopefully next week I will not be delayed. Laird, thank you very much for this makeup time.
Yep.
It's much appreciated. You are a gentleman and a scholar, as always.
Thank you very much, Chris.
All right, and stay on the line so I can give you the good handshake goodbye off camera. But to all of you out there, stay thirsty and stay hydrated. Let's see. Screen share, split screen, outro. Is there an outro? There we go.